when I was at Newcastle University, 5% of architects were women. And so that it was quite interesting because that's where I did my undergraduate course. And unusually in our year, 25% of our year were women. And in the sort of third year of our course, we were asked to do a group project on housing. And interestingly, the majority of women in the year thought that it would be interesting to run it as a women-only project. And that there was no feminism behind that. It was just housing is women's realm, and it would be interesting to do this together. And what sort of really alerted me to the fact that there was a really big issue was the reaction from the staff. The year tutor and the head of school each came to talk to us, to explain to us that we shouldn't be doing this as women only project. They thought it was really wrong. And the head of school even got his wife, who was an architect, in to talk to us and explain to us why, as women, we should be designing as professionals, we shouldn't be designing as women. We ignored them and went ahead. But it was actually a very sort of formative project, because we then spent a lot of time interviewing women in Newcastle about what they thought about their housing. And it was just at the time that the Biker Wall had been built by Ralph Erskine. And there was a lot of interesting discussion about local communities and how much they should be involved in the provision of their own housing. And actually at Newcastle University, there were several other women who later became involved in Matrix, Anne de Graaf Johnson, Susan Francis, Frances Bradshaw, and Barbara McFarlane. We weren't all in the same year, but we did all know each other and all became sort of very interested through student things about, well, it was a combination of talking about participation and talking about where did women fit into any of this. And then I went on and worked at the GLC housing department in my year out, and got more involved in housing there. And at that point also met with Ben Fu, who later became part of Matrix as well. And I had my first son in 1976. And became quite astonished. In those days, really, it's difficult to imagine it now, but most cafes and restaurants, you couldn't take a child in a pushchair. There was no disability access. There were a lot of places that women were excluded from in the public realm. And it was actually very difficult getting on public transport. You know, there were no particular spaces for pushchairs or anything like that at all. And it just made me sort of realize that the world wasn't designed for me. It was designed for all these other people. So then I went, and so then during that time, I also got involved with the New Architecture movement, which was a socialist movement. And then I went back to college at PCL, and I wrote my thesis on women's creativity in architectural design, with reference to women in literature. And spent quite a lot of my time looking at things like the design guides used at the GLC for reference for women's roles, and what designers thought the space for women was about. And it was all about women cooking, caring for people. None of it was about women doing anything for themselves. And so then, yes, being involved with the New Architecture movement, several of the women involved in that got quite upset about I don't know, we just sort of began talking about the sexist advertising that there was in the building industry at the time. So there's often naked women advertising rainwater pipes or, you know, anything else really. And that it was actually, you'd walk into, I mean, I'd been on site a lot at the GLC. And so I was on site on a very big site, which had probably 500 people working on it. And I was the only woman on the site. And just walking into the offices, there were naked women sort of pinned up on all the office walls and everything. It was very, and every time I walked into work, they wolf whistled at me. It was really quite extraordinary now to look back on that. I mean, I think a bit of that happens, but you don't just think you're going to walk into site and that everybody thinks that's okay. And they said to me, we don't believe in women doing the job that you're doing, but if you're going to do this job, we're going to treat you like a man, which I said, great, that's what I want. And they did, to give them their due, so that was good. But then, so going back, sorry, I'm digressing. Then we went, so getting involved in the new architecture movement, then gradually we formed the Feminist Architects Network and started discussing what a lot of these issues and what we thought was women's role on a building site, in design and all of those things. And gradually women's groups, I mean, the feminist movement was obviously going on sort of next to us and we were aware of it, and you know, everybody read Spare Rib and all of those sort of things. So this wasn't within a sort of vacuum, but and gradually women's groups heard about this network of women architects and asked us if we'd do some feasibility studies for us. So the first one was Stockwell Health Centre, where we were asked to look at the design that the local health authority had done for a health centre. And the women who were involved in that wanted it to actually have somewhere for the buggies to be stored, the prams, you know, somewhere for children to play, somewhere for there to be sessions about women's health and things like that, which hadn't, you know, which weren't designed into the original design at all. And so we got quite involved in doing that and doing different designs for that. We weren't really formed into a practice, and we were all quite young, so they didn't trust us to. The health service would never have allowed us to actually do the design. So they got some other architects in to do it once they'd agreed what was going to happen, and that did get built. A lot of our ideas were involved with that, the Feminist Architects Network. And then we were also asked to be involved in Lambeth Women's Workshop, which was one of the first, well, probably the first workshop actually for women to learn traditional building skills. So it was a carpentry workshop mainly, but they did do other things as well. And Mary Lou Ascott and I were the main people who designed that. Mary Lou had actually done a lot of work as a carpenter herself and had trained as a carpenter, and as well as an architect. And so we worked together on that. And Susan Francis then took over from me because then I had my second child in 1980.
I think it was in the sort of later years that question came up. I mean, I think in the earlier years, that was how the cooperative had formed. At the time, I can't remember whether I think only one person was a qualified architect at the time, and I think when it was first formed, I think you might need to check that with the founders. But one of the things that a lot of us, when we sort of left architecture school, quite a lot of us were questioning the profession and the ethos of the profession, and that meant that we were sort of questioning whether to actually take our Part 3 examination and qualify as architects. So some people, quite a number of people, deferred doing that, and then eventually, you know, more people became architects, and the name changed, I think, to recognise that. But my recollection is that for most of the time, most people were happy about a flat pay structure.
I joined Matrix in 1987, so they have been going for a few years, and I'd heard of them. I was a student in Hull. I did my Part 2 architectural, postgrad bit in Hull, which at the time was, I suppose, quite radical politically. There was a lot of the students were a lot of the sort of the part of running the school. It was a very democratic place, and students got to choose their own projects. You could devise your own brief, and everyone did their own thing. Excuse me. And part of that meant that we increasingly got involved in community projects locally, working with the community in Hull. And I suppose it was what went on to become, a few years later, community architecture, the community architecture movement. And from the working with community groups in Hull and working with participatory design, I went on then to work for a technical aid centre, community technical aid. And Matrix at the time were part of ACTAC, which was the Association of Community Technical Aid Centres. So it was a national network. And some of the other members had been going quite a few years before Matrix, but they were very much of the same ethos, the same idea about involving the users of the building in the design and giving them control over the brief and the end result, and understanding the process, enabling them really all the way through. So after I graduated or left my Part 2, before I did my Part 3 actually, I went to work for Comtexa in Liverpool, which is a community run initiative and was a cooperative, and worked there for a year. And then for Community Design Service in Cardiff, which was another community technical aid centre. And when I decided to move to London, I applied. I didn't actually apply to Matrix. I applied to another practice called Casino, who were an architecture cooperative as well, in Hackney. And they actually passed my application to Matrix, because Matrix were in the office on the other side of the landing in Bradbury Street, in the Street of 1,000 Co-ops, as it was then known, because it's Hackney Cooperative Development. And I didn't even know Matrix was advertising at the time. So Annie Thorne phoned me up, and I went down for an interview. And I think it was Annie and Ben Fu was still there at the time, and Julia Dwyer. And there were, I think, 8 or 9 of Matrix at the time, but they were quite busy. They had a lot of projects. They were pretty much fully funded by the, was the GLC, and then went on to be the body that administered the grants after that. And a lot of the projects they were doing, a lot of the experience I'd had was very relevant to the type of projects they were doing, although I hadn't been working specifically with women's groups. So I suppose my feminism was sort of slightly more in the background, and it was more my community activism, if you like, or involvement in community projects. It was the main kind of reason I ended up working with them. But it was actually, so that came to the fore later, I guess. My feminism has been more of a kind of personal statement rather than in any of the work I was doing up to then.
Hull School of Architecture. I know that Sheila McManus, who is a co-op member, she also studied there, but I didn't know that at the time. And the reason I'm saying that was that she was at Matrix, and she came with another member to be a guest critic on some of the students' projects, and she happened to sit in on mine. I was doing a project for a couple, John and John. I remember it very, very well. And the client was also there, or it was an interim crit, whatever. It was a live project for them. And at the end of my crit, Sheila and I think Rachel, they approached me and said that they really liked my work, they liked my approach and how I talked about the sort of client consultation and making sure that the client's needs were fully met as best as possibly could, and then interpreted, you know, what their wishes were with regards to their home and their sort of like a work and home environment. One was a musician and one was a writer, an artist. And then they said, would you be interested in working for Matrix? And I think I was in my end of my 4th year. I think I was around about that time, and I decided to try it. I just went along for the summer. I applied as everybody else did. There was a very extensive interview process that I had to go through, but I felt quite flattered. And at that time, I didn't really know anything about them. But what I could say is that my work was very much about looking and hearing the voices of those that weren't necessarily heard. So whether that be women, whether that be, you know, people of colour, whether that be children, access. A lot of my projects, looking back on them, were always about that. So, you know, for example, my final scheme was a hospice, and it was about making sure that relatives could also stay in the accommodation with their family members, that kind of thing. I did a children's museum of music, and, you know, I had sort of like interactive pieces for children and teachers and carers to, you know, to be able to access. A lot of my dissertation was looking at, in fact, it was about partly about Aldo van Eyck. I don't know if you know Aldo van Eyck, and he's fantastic. He's one of my heroes. And the Dogon tribe, and that's a tribe that he used to talk about a lot and introduce some of their ethos and symbology into their work. I also wrote about sort of racism in housing, and looked at some some housing schemes in Hackney at the time. So looking back, I kind of had an empathy with the kind of work that they were doing, but I had never ever come across a practice like theirs. I love the facts, I love the scale, I thought the work was incredible. And so I just went along, and I was lucky enough to get through the interview process for the summer, and then full-time for about 5 years. And that's kind of how, yeah, they approached me, and I was really interested. And it was kind of like a roller coaster experience following that. Just amazing. Just, you know, I qualified at Matrix. I did my part 3 there. So it's just an amazing, yeah. So, you know, it was a uphill learning experience, because you were thrown in at the deep end. You had access to everything, you know, i.e. how the practice was run, taking responsibility for the practice, the accounts, what the books looked like. You know, we had our co-op meetings once a week, and having to sit in on that and doing that. That was when I saw the process of what it's like to be in a cooperative, because I've never ever dealt with anything like that in my life. And looking back, I think it was quite naive. But you know, we spent a lot of time in co-op meetings. That I do remember, and thinking, gosh, what about the architecture? You know, we're going to talk about the architecture and projects. And of course we did, but we also talked about other issues, you know, about how the practice was being run and various things. Yeah, so it was an interesting experience. And then when I left in that summer, I was asked if I would like to come back again. So I can't remember whether I had to reapply, but I probably did, probably had another interview, because again, the process was one of fairness. And so I then went, I think that was in 1990 until 1994, as I said, and that's when I started getting a little bit more involved in projects. And one of the things about Matrix that I will, you know, that I miss today as a practicing architect is the variety and diversity of projects.
after I've left Matrix, I've gone on. I've been working in social housing ever since, and I've been working in all women. I have worked in all women practices. But the thing that was different about being at Matrix, I think, was that there was a whole other dimension to what we did. We had fortnightly policy meetings in the evenings where we would talk about specific topics related to work or politics at the time, or ideas for new initiatives that we should be following, which had come out of our work with groups. There was a tendency, I think, at times though, to become a bit inward looking. So we had we were quite tough on each other, I think, in terms of any behaviour that was maybe less than exemplary in terms of our policy, anything that could be construed as discriminatory or dismissive, I suppose. We were quite tough with each other, I think, and we were all quite emotionally involved in what we were doing as well. So at times it was pretty stressful at times, if I'm honest. And I think maybe that's a tendency I've realised later of women as well, to be quite hard on each other, quite hard on yourself as well, in terms of setting expectations quite high, and it not necessarily being possible to live up to them all of the time, and not forgiving yourself very easily for when you fall short of that standard.
Well, I was very, very absorbed in the work of Matrix. I think one of the things that I think nearly everybody who worked for Matrix, did more than, in other words, kind of one of these ones that I tell my students not to do 48-hour kind of stints, but actually the main issue, I think, with Matrix is most people worked too hard. I always found Matrix really, really interesting, so it was kind of, completely absorbed my attention for the 12 years I was there. I think different relationships varied, and there's always a sort of discussion about, kind of flat structures versus hierarchical structures. We had, to some extent, a flat structure, but that didn't mean necessarily that there weren't people who took more of a lead than others. I think one of the things that I personally, although I learned, I did learn a lot about. I did a lot of reading around both feminism, but also race and history. So I learned a lot from clients and users, and I learned a lot from ways of working and practice, and thinking about that. What I don't think we ever really got to grips with was race. And that, I'm not the only black woman at Matrix that had issues around that. And that, some of that was about some of the attitudes of not all, but some clients, some consultants, etc., etc. And difficulty in talking about it.
Right.
In Matrix.